The spread of education in society provides the foundations of success in countries that are latecomers to development. Primary education of acceptable quality creates the base. Equal opportunities along with universal access in school education are critical, but access without quality is no access. Higher education then imparts the cutting edge. For countries at low income levels, the development of human resources is an obviously essential role of governments, which is borne out by the experience of countries that are success stories in Asia's development during the past 50 years. This is amongst the biggest failures in independent India, which needs to be addressed and corrected. In fact, investing in the development of human resources, people, is important for countries at every stage of their development. The object of my lecture is to focus on the state of higher education in India in retrospect and prospect. The structure of what I have to say is as follows. First, I will highlight the symptoms of the malaise in higher education, which began life almost 40 years ago and built up slowly to gather momentum over time, creating a crisis that is now visible and could be at a tipping point. Second, I will examine how political intrusion and government intervention in higher education, particularly universities, has led to a progressive deterioration in the situation. Third, I will discuss developments in the sphere of higher education during the past decade, which has witnessed a pronounced increase in political and governmental intervention by introducing institutional control mechanisms that encroach upon the autonomy of universities and by influencing appointments at universities. Fourth, I will explain why institutional autonomy and academic freedom in higher education, particularly universities, are essential not only for advancing learning and knowledge, but also in the wider context of political democracy. Fifth, I will set out some conclusions. Let me begin with the crisis. There is a quiet crisis in higher education in India that runs deep. It is visible. The educational opportunities for school leavers are simply not enough, and those that exist are not good enough. The pockets of excellence are outcomes of an enormous reservoir of talent and Darwinian selection processes. It does little for those with average abilities or without social opportunities. The challenges confronting higher education in India are clear. It needs a massive expansion to educate much larger numbers without diluting academic standards. Indeed, it is just as important to raise average quality. What is more, in terms of access, it needs to be far more inclusive, and it needs some institutions, each with a certain critical mass, that are exemplars of excellence at par with the best in the world. Such excellence, I'm sad to say, is largely missing, while it is diminishing rapidly in the few pockets where it existed. Indeed, in terms of world university rankings, which have become the fashion in recent years, our performance is most disappointing. For those who set high standards, it borders on the dismal. Of course, it must be said that these rankings have all the limitations of composite index numbers, since it's difficult to measure qualitative attributes while weights assigned to different components shape results. Even so, it is obvious that our universities have miles to go before reaching world standards. Islands of excellence, IITs, IIMs, the Indian Institute of Science, are no consolation. For one, successive governments have sought to multiply the number of IITs, IIMs, and now IISERs, but the inevitable outcome is highly uneven quality and a dilution of the brand equity of existing institutions that have already attained academic excellence. For another, the lifeblood of higher education is not small institutes, but large universities providing educational opportunities for young people. Alas, the comparative advantage that India had, at least in a few of its universities, has been slowly yet surely squandered over time. And sadly, even that little that remains is being progressively undermined by the growing intrusion of politics in universities. But that is not all. Systematic and mindless under-resourcing of public higher education is also a reason for the steady regression in quality of universities. Such processes are almost irreversible because there are long-term consequences of short-term interventions. Physicists describe this phenomenon as hysteresis. The situation is much worse than it was a decade ago. Universities have deteriorated rapidly in India, while universities elsewhere in the developing world, particularly in Asia and even more so in China, have made significant progress. There is a clear and present danger that unless we introduce correctives, the situation might worsen further to transform us from erstwhile leaders into laggards or worse. There is intense competition among our students for admissions to public universities, which have a semblance of reputations for standards, despite the divergence in quality. The fortunate few who do well in Class 12 examinations take up these limited spaces, while most, the less fortunate, make do with institutions in the private sector where fees are always high, while apart from a few exceptions, quality is mostly poor. Of course, quality is uneven both in public institutions and in the private sector, but exceptions to these generalizations simply prove the rule. Only the privileged few have parents rich enough to send them abroad instead. During the past 25 years, the number of students from India going abroad for higher education increased rapidly from roughly 50,000 in the year 2000 to 350,000 in 2015. This number climbed to 600,000 in 2019 when the pandemic shut down universities. It rose further to 900,000 in 2023. It is estimated that in 2023, of the students going abroad to study, 30% go to the United States, 25% to Canada, 20% to the UK, while 10% go to Australia and New Zealand. Now, I should also add that in 2024, it is estimated that of the 1.5 million foreign students in the United States, more than 1/4 are from India. Now, if we assume that their average expenditure on fees and maintenance is $30,000 per annum, in 2023, Indian students overseas spent $27 billion, which is about the same as India's foreign exchange earnings from tourism in 2023. However, annual expenses on fees and maintenance to rich countries are much higher, so that the costs would be proportionally higher. These sums, if made available for higher education in India, could help transform at least some universities. But that is not all. A large proportion of students who go abroad for higher education no longer return to India. And the corollary, the number of foreign students at universities in India, even from South Asian countries, has collapsed to negligible levels. It is attributable to the ethos and the quality of our universities. I can tell you it was not so long ago when I taught at JNU in the 90s, I had PhD students from abroad, one from France, one from Korea, one from Japan, and many of my colleagues had PhD students who came from Europe or other parts of Asia to work with us. Now, our higher education is caught in a pincer movement. For one, there is a belief that markets can solve the problem through private players, which is leading to education as business, shutting the door on large numbers who cannot finance themselves without regulation that would ensure quality. For another, governments that believe in the magic of markets are virtual control freaks with respect to public universities. This is motivated by the desire to exercise political influence in higher education for patronage, ideology, rents, or simply vested interests. Besides, there is an erroneous notion in policy circles that the maintenance of quality and standards are possible only through standardization and centralization. The government. Now, second, let me turn to my propositions about political intrusion in universities. Now, Political interference by the central government or the state governments in their respective domains, which encroaches on the autonomy of universities, inevitably accentuates problems in the sphere of higher education. Every government and every party are culpable in the growing politicization of universities in India. This strangles autonomy and stifles creativity without creating any accountability. The quality of higher education is collateral damage. Such political intrusion in universities is not new. Starting in the early 1970s, state governments began to interfere in universities. For one, it was about dispensing patronage and exercising power in the appointment of vice-chancellors, faculty and non-teaching staff. For another, it was about extending the political influence of ruling parties. Unions of students, teachers and employees became instruments in political processes. Campuses were slowly turned into spheres of influence for political parties as elections were won or lost. It was not long before similar reasons began to influence the attitudes of central government towards universities. The turning point might have been the emergency during 1975-77. This increased in its incidence and spread during the quarter century of coalition governments from 1989 to 2014. A few that were short-lived, although 4 completed 5-year terms. But there were regime changes almost after every general election. The competitive politics unleashed by changes in governments soon spilt over into universities, not only as spheres of influence, but also as arenas for political contests. The discomfiture with independent or critical voices, even if few, surfaced in the public domain. Central universities were no longer immune. Political intervention and encroachment by the government gathered momentum after the general election in 2014, when the BJP won an absolute majority in parliament and Narendra Modi assumed office as Prime Minister. The past 5 years since 2019 have witnessed a rapid acceleration in this process. It has now reached a stage where the future of public universities in India is at grave risk, if not already over the edge of the precipice. Alas, the political process, parties and governments alike, meddled in universities. The irony of double standards was stunning. The same political parties, when in government, invoked public interest, and when in opposition, waxed eloquent about autonomy and freedom for universities. The decline of public universities in India has been an inevitable consequence of this process. Every government laments the absence of world-class universities without realizing that it is attributable in part to their interventions and the growing intrusion of political processes. The downward trajectory, to me, who have lived a life in the classroom, is no surprise. It is essential to recognize that the blame for the state of our universities cannot be laid at the door of politics and governments alone. Universities as communities and as institutions are just as much to blame. The quality of leadership at universities has declined rapidly, in part because of partisan appointments by governments or vice-chancellors who are simply not good enough as academics or administrators, and in part because most vice-chancellors simply do not have the courage and the integrity to stand up to governments, but have an eye on the next job they might get. The professoriate, forgive me, is mostly either complicit as part of the political process in teachers' unions or just silent, preferring to look the other way, engaged in narrow academic pursuits. Those who stand up are too few. The students are either caught up in the same party political unions or opt out to concentrate on their academic tasks, understandably. For university communities, it is imperative to recognize that such compromises are self-destructive as acts of commission. So is opting out as an act of commission, as an act of omission. If universities want autonomy, it will not be conferred on them by benevolent governments. They have to claim, indeed consciously protect their autonomy, simply because autonomy is, my favorite phrase, as autonomy does. Alas, this has become exceedingly difficult in the present milieu. The BJP, with an absolute majority in the Lok Sabha, was the ruling party in the government of India from 2014 to 2024. In mid-25, The BJP is not only the largest constituent of the NDA coalition that rules the central government, but is also the ruling party in 19 of our 28 states. The ideology of the BJP and the RSS, which shapes their political and social perspective, is now exercising a profound influence on higher education in India. In this context, it is essential to focus on recent developments in the world of higher education, where rules of the game sought to be created are conducive to an institutional capture already in progress. Now, third, let me turn to some facts about recent developments. In the social sciences, especially economics, stylized facts represent a simplified description of observed realities to highlight essential truths in the form of broad generalizations that sketch the bigger picture without specific evidence on individual details, so that there could be exceptions in some individual cases. Now, this has a long intellectual tradition. In 1936, Jan Tinbergen, Nobel laureate in economics, wrote, "To get a clear view, stylization is indispensable. The many phenomena must be grouped in such a way that the picture becomes clear without losing its characteristic traits. Stylization is essential. The alternative," Tinbergen said, "is barrenness." The term stylized facts was introduced by Nicholas Calder, a professor at Cambridge, whom I much admire, theorizing about growth in 1961, who suggested that, I quote, "Analysts should be free to start off with a stylized view of facts, concentrate on broad tendencies, ignoring individual detail," end of quote. A similar approach was adopted by Simon Kuznets, another Nobel laureate in economics, in his work on economic growth and structural change. Now, I will use the legacy of this analytical method to sketch the broad contours of the profound changes in the world of higher education, especially universities. The stylized facts I will set out are based on conversations that I've had with the cross-section of persons in university communities across the country over the past 3-5 years, including vice-chancellors, principals, professors, lecturers, PhD students, as well as undergraduate and postgraduate students. Reports in the print media have also been a very valuable source. Most people are conscious of this reality and share their concerns in private conversations. But much like the elephant in the room, no one speaks about it in the public domain. Fools rush in where angels fear to tread, and perhaps I am one. Even so, I believe that it is time to place the debate and our concerns about higher education in the public sphere. Indeed, speaking truth to power is a belief I've always held, but is our right and our obligation as citizens in a political democracy. I wish people spoke up more, but I'm going to make this beginning. The period since 1914 has witnessed a pronounced increase in political intrusion and government intervention in universities, which has gathered further momentum since 2019. There are two apparent manifestations of this unfolding reality. First, there is a visible emergence of institutionalized control mechanisms that decide what universities can or cannot do. Second, appointments in universities, which should be the domain of universities alone, are increasingly influenced, if not shaped, by the political motivation and the invisible hands of governments in office. The primary instrument of control in the sphere of teaching, whether appointments or curriculum, is the UGC. There are subsidiary instruments of control in the sphere of research, indirectly through institutions such as the Indian Councils of Social Science Research, Historical Research, Philosophical Research, Agricultural Research, Medical Research, or the CSIR, the Department of Science and Technology, the Department of Biotechnology, all of which are funded by the central government to finance their respective institutions, but also to support selected research projects proposed by individual scholars. So research support in India is controlled largely by the government. And its disbursement, I gather from many people active in academia, is less than fair. Now, even admission processes have been centralized in the National Testing Agency. Okay? the Central University's entrance test, the JEE, the NEET, I confuse this alphabet soup, the competence and integrity of which has been repeatedly questioned in the public domain. Everyone present in this room would have read in the newspapers about the faux pas in NEET in 2024, exam paper leaks, arbitrary changes between marks uploaded on the website and final marks awarded, JEE 2025, mountains of errors, some leakages, CUET 2025, the less said the better. Now, the rationale for such a centralization, I think, is questionable and flawed. Let me give you two examples. You know, the IITs have run the JEE exam without flaw for decades, for half a century. Yeah? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. You look at the national eligibility and entrance tests, but please remember that there's a Supreme Court order from the mid-1950s which says 85% of all seats in public medical schools will be reserved for those domiciled in that state. And these tests were actually run by teaching hospitals, government teaching hospitals, 2 or 3, a consortium, in every state. And there was never a problem. It went smoothly. Now, why the need for centralization? Now, this centralization in admissions extends beyond tests. For example, despite the CUET, and I don't know why we needed it, you know, all universities use CBSE, ICSE grades, which announces its scores, just as CBSE, ICSE, and state boards did. The University of Delhi now decides on admissions to all its constituent colleges in one office, taking away that right to decide from its undergraduate colleges, all 85 of them, which performed this function for 75 years. There is no traceability, there's no transparency, there's no accountability in this process. At universities, the appointment of vice-chancellors is the essential first step, if not a necessary condition for subsequent intervention. So let me begin the story there. Now, in central universities, due process sets out statutes, and these are followed in letter through a search committee that includes 2 members nominated by the University Executive Council, now pre-selected for loyalty, and a chair nominated by the visitor, the President of India, now decided by the Ministry of Education, who submit a panel of names. It's the prerogative of the visitor, the President of India, who's not bound by the advice of the Council of Ministers in this matter, to select the Vice-Chancellor from the panel submitted by the search committee. Alas, all these checks and balances now exist only in letter, but not in spirit. Once the Vice-Chancellor is appointed, the appointment of deans of faculties and heads of departments is the next step. Now, for those who knew me when I was at the University of Delhi, I was never an admirer of the rotation principle or the seniority principle in appointing heads or deans. But it had one virtue. It was non-discretionary. It is now abandoned. There is a purposive selection of deans and heads, which is critical in the appointment of academics. But these people are no longer independent voices. The selection of faculty members for appointment in university departments follows the due process set out in statutes, which is observed in letter but violated in spirit. The selection process is manipulated through a purposive selection of subject experts who are mostly not qualified for the role, and I'll give you many examples in Q&A. They're often from small provincial universities or undergraduate colleges in Chhattisgarh, no offense meant, in Bihar, for prestigious central university appointments of professors in departments. Now, there is a similar pre-selection in the shortlisting of candidates. It is decided. And subject experts often refuse to sign the minute unless the specified candidates are selected. Yeah? The process is very similar for appointing lecturers in appointments at colleges, whether they are constituent or affiliated. Such manipulated selections are not limited, as some people believe, to social sciences and humanities. but are also common practice in science and engineering subjects. It would be no exaggeration to state that faculty appointments at universities and undergraduate colleges are increasingly driven by RSS ideology and BJP preferences in politics rather than talent or merit. I will give you some examples in Q&A. Thus, if political intervention in universities is leading to academic appointments of persons who are not fit to teach, for example, a Sanskritist in a department of English literature, a mathematician in a department of physics. Now, this is bound to hurt successive future generations of students. The quality of appointments to faculty positions will shape the future of higher education, as these are permanent positions until the age of retirement, 65 years. Now, the reason is simple. A person appointed as professor at the age of 40 will serve for 25 years, while a person appointed as lecturer at the age of 25 will serve for 40 years. Now, if they're not good enough, what's going to happen to our universities? Now, this is bound to have long-term consequences, mortgaging the future of public universities in India. It won't matter if Mr. Modi loses the next election, although that's unlikely, because just remember Om Prakash Chautala. You know, he appointed something like 12,000 teachers in schools through the Haryana Public Service Commission, was caught out for taking money, went to prison, in fact died in prison. He died in Tihar jail. But the Punjab and Haryana High Court ruled that all those teachers will continue because it's not their fault that they were appointed. Yeah. Now, the checks and balances built into the statutes for university appointments so far are being circumvented through purposive manipulation, as well as the process, in the choice of members or subject experts in selection committees, as well as the process of shortlisting candidates. However, the draft UGC regulations 2025 announced, I think 2 or 3 months ago, are explicit in reducing these checks and balances. For example, the search cum selection committee for vice-chancellors will no longer have 2 members other than the chairperson nominated by the Executive Council of the university. Instead, 1 will be a nominee of the chairman UGC, while only 1 will be a nominee, not necessarily of the Executive Council. It could be the syndicate, it could be the Senate, whatever. For central universities, the chairperson will be a nominee of the visitor, the President of India, in effect the Ministry of Education now, as at present. This was not true for earlier presidents. But for state universities, the Search Cum Selection Committee with the same composition will be constituted by the Chancellor, Governor of the state, who in turn is a nominee of the central government, so that university executive councils or even state governments will have no role in the process, which can only erode federalism. For education is a concurrence list, in the concurrent list of the Constitution of India. Now, the composition of the selection committee for academic appointments in universities stipulated by UGC now, with the Vice-Chancellor as chair, a teacher in the rank of professor nominated by the visitor chancellor, unlike the visitors' nominees of the past in central universities, who were all distinguished scholars for each faculty, 3 subject experts nominated by the Vice-Chancellor, the dean of the faculty, and the head of the department. There will be almost no checks and balances left. Now, it is not as if there are any external checks and balances. The National Accreditation and Assessment Council, NAAC, intended to be the gold standard for assessing the quality of higher education in India, which it never was, is in the midst of its biggest ever crisis. The recent dismissal of 900 persons from its peer review panel of 5,000 assessors, as well as the arrest of a JNU professor in a bribery scandal, has raised serious doubts about the integrity of its assessment process. Indeed, it is time for a rigorous scrutiny of the NAAC itself. Can the evaluation of universities, hence their appointments, be left to a corrupt institution? Now, in principle, determining and maintaining standards of teaching, examination, and research at universities is among the primary functions of UGC. How can it independently evaluate the quality of university appointments if it is such an integral, if not complicit, part of the process? In my view, and it's been a view for a long time, UGC is the problem, which cannot be a solution. It performs the functions of licensing, regulation, and disbursement. These three functions are not performed by one institution anywhere in the world. Not anywhere in the world. There are three separate agencies, because it eliminates all checks and balances. But such power enables the UGC to exercise enormous control over universities. Its interventions at political behest compound difficulties. Its belief that one size must fit all drives its fetish for standardization, whether curricular, appointment, promotions, evaluation, or institutional architecture. The outcome is that every university must move at the speed of the slowest. Yeah? Now, in economics, we call this the convoy problem. But it's worse. What happens is you tend to drop to the quality of the lowest in this process. Now, such leveling crowds out or preempts excellence because it stifles diversity, pluralism, differentiation in higher education, all of which are necessary to develop excellence. Now, the higher education sector, how am I doing for time? Well, I was going to talk a little bit about IITs and IIMs, and maybe I should very briefly. The higher education sector extends beyond universities to IITs, IIMs. Now, the story is broadly similar in the appointment of directors as well as the boards of governors for these institutions. For IITs, the chairman of the board of governors is appointed by the visitor, Ministry of Education, and the director is appointed by the IIT's council with the prior approval of the Ministry of Education. The independence and autonomy of IIT boards and IIT council, in fairness, I have to say, has diminished over time, particularly since 2019, but this process began around 2011 under UPA2. That was the beginning of this process. For IIMs, there was far more autonomy until 2011. Until then, the chairman of the board was appointed on the recommendation of the board with the concurrence of the Government of India and the state government, which was almost an automatic process. When I taught at IIM Calcutta from 1980 to 83, the faculty used to propose board members, and it would go through. Now, the problem is that even under the IIMs Act of 2017, which happened in the BJP government, the Board of Governors had the authority to appoint its chairman and the director. Yeah? The latter had to be based on the recommendation of a selection search committee. This has now been changed with amendments to the IIMs Act in August 2023. The President of India is designated as the visitor for all IIMs with the authority to A, nominate the chairman of the board, B, suspend or dissolve the board if deemed necessary, C, appoint a selection panel for a new director, and D, appoint and remove the director of an IIM. In effect, what I'm saying is governance and leadership roles at IITs and IIMs are now decided upon by the Government of India through the Ministry of Education. The rest is window dressing. Such centralization does also slow down decision-making. In April 2025, I counted there were 6 central universities, 3 IIMs, 3 IITs that did not have heads, regularly appointed heads. Now, 4, I've used up 33 minutes. All right, I have some time. Everyone, I want to turn to the sanctity. Why does academic freedom matter? Yeah? For everyone here is not an academic, and it is important for citizens to understand why it matters. Everyone engaged in higher education recognizes that academic freedom is primary because universities are places for raising doubts and asking questions about everything. Exploring ideas, debating issues, and thinking independently are essential in the quest for excellence in all academic disciplines, whether humanities, social sciences, natural sciences, life sciences, medicine, engineering, technology, everywhere. After all, knowledge develops only if we question existing knowledge. This means that students must have the freedom to ask questions, just as faculty must have the freedom to question received wisdom in their respective disciplines. Indeed, universities and institutions must have the freedom to raise questions express opinions, or articulate criticisms in the wider context of the economy, polity, and society. In fact, for me, the development of knowledge is central to university education. Students enter the world of higher education to learn. Understanding existing knowledge is but a first step. The ability to ask relevant questions, a capacity to critique conventional wisdoms, and the confidence to resist the authority of the spoken, if not the printed word, are the next successive steps in learning. Of course, learning is a continuous process. It never stops. It hasn't stopped for me at my age. Thus, it is for universities to decide what is taught to students, which must not be controlled from elsewhere. And there should be no restrictions on who is invited to address a student audience. Circumscribing this space in any way can only stifle learning, which in turn can hurt economic and social progress. Now, the world of research needs similar freedoms. It is for universities to decide their research priorities. It is for faculty members to decide their research agenda. Of course, financial support for such research must be based on peer review, without preference, without prejudice. Dissenting opinions or unorthodox thinking, irrespective of disciplines, should be encouraged, because that is how knowledge develops. In fact, fundamental research needs far more in terms of not only freedoms, but also resources and time. Now, I remember Tom Bollinger, whom I knew well, who was president of Columbia earlier at the University of Michigan, who once told me that, Deepak, there is so much pressure to appoint the competent. Yeah? It's safe. But, you know, universities need brilliant people, and they can never be bland. That's how knowledge develops. Now, such an environment, I believe, is essential for brilliant scholars or thinkers to surface, blossom, and flourish. The unfolding reality is disturbing. Curriculums are regulated and straitjacketed. Readings are prescribed. Indeed, what is excluded or what is included in prescribed reading lists is decided elsewhere, not necessarily by the teachers. Promising research, which departs from the mainstream, is stifled. In this milieu, fundamental research at universities in India is rare, if not impossible. It is no accident that our universities have not produced any Nobel laureates. And I think they never will in the next 25 years, the way we are going. Now, even the freedom for students and teachers to organize discussions or debates on campus, which are perceived as critical of the BJP or its governments at the center or the states where it rules, is circumscribed everywhere, often by administrative fiat or penal action. I won't give you examples. All of you read the newspapers. We read about it every day. At many central universities, and this is awesome, if a faculty member applies for duty leave to participate in a conference abroad, he or she has to provide a written undertaking that, and I quote, this is from 3 central universities, I will not participate in any anti-government activities. While I am abroad, whether on official duty or on a personal visit, I shall be subject to all the provisions of government servants' conduct rules, including those relating to connection with the press and criticism of the government. Further, I understand that any breach of these provisions, whether committed in India or abroad, shall render me equally liable to disciplinary action. I didn't realize that university professors are civil servants. Universities are autonomous institutions. Why should government rules be imposed on them? Now, such intrusion in different forms is now being extended to private universities. Dissenting or critical voices of students or faculty members are silenced by disciplinary action. This is private universities. In some cases, it goes further, essentially because risk-averse promoters fall in line. There are many examples. Vice-chancellors have been removed, faculty members have been sacked, some have been asked to resign. All of you read the newspapers. I won't go into that, but we'll return to this question, if you wish, Meenakshi, later. Now, just as important, the autonomy of university spaces is also sacrosanct in the wider context of political democracy. where universities perform an important role in addition to imparting education for human resource development. In the economy, they are a source of ideas for science, technology, R&D, innovation, and until Trump happened, that was where the US lead came from, or economic and social policies. In society, they are conscious keepers as public intellectuals from among the faculty who engage with the public domain, inform citizens, write columns in newspapers, do interviews on television. In the polity, their evaluation or assessment of the performance of governments fosters accountability. Yeah? Of course, the autonomy must have a corresponding accountability. I'm not saying universities are lords unto themselves, but it is essential for governments to recognize that the provision of resources to universities does not endow them with the right to exercise controls. The resources are public money for public universities, which must be accountable to students and society through institutional mechanisms that exist or can be created. For this purpose, it is imperative that structures of governance in universities are appropriate for and conducive to accountability. Good governance, and that's the theme, is necessary but not sufficient. There must be checks and balances in the public domains. Now, rankings of universities, for all their flaws and warts, perform an important role in this context. Such rankings, despite their limitations, provide students, their parents, and society at large such an institutional mechanism for accountability. Institutions in higher education evolve much like organisms. Their trajectory is shaped by the context, which can range from the conjuncture in time, to the quality of leadership, to the political context or the social milieu. It is absolutely essential that regulatory structures provide complete autonomy, administrative, financial, and academic to universities. Liberation from the shackles of UGC is a necessary condition. If I ever get the opportunity, I would abolish the UGC. Yeah? Its functions will continue to be performed, but you will need 3 agencies to do that. The existing parliamentary or legislative acts that created our universities also have many constraints and fetters. Thus, as an approach, it would be far better to reform regulatory structures, provide autonomy to universities, and ensure accountability through systems rather than interventions or controls, to create an environment that encourages freedom of thought and is conducive to learning. The quest for uniformity is the worst enemy of thinking, creativity, understanding, and knowledge, which can thrive only in open societies. One size fits all is a flawed presumption. Indeed, diversity and differentiation are an integral part, have always been and will always be an integral part of the quest for excellence in higher education. In conclusion, all right? That's 42 minutes, sorry. I'll stop at 45. In conclusion, I'd like to examine the implications and consequences of the crisis in higher education, which I've discussed in my lecture, for the future of economic and social progress in India, and what this might mean for realizing the aspiration of a Viksit Bharat, a developed high-income country in 2047. It is clear that the process of appointments at universities, undergraduate colleges, or other higher education institutions in India is now seriously flawed. It is no longer objective. Indeed, selections are shaped by political preferences and political networks. The quality of those appointed to leadership positions in higher education, even if for limited tenures, is critical because they willingly cede the autonomy of their institutional space for their political commitment or simply their career paths. The quality of those appointed to faculty positions is perhaps even more critical because it will shape the future of higher education. If persons who are not fit to teach are appointed to faculty positions, is bound to hurt successive generations of future generations of students, as these are permanent positions until retirement do us part. This can only mortgage, as I said, the future of public universities in India. Now, I recognize it is exceedingly difficult to reverse such processes, even if and when governments change, because the time lags in implementing correctives are long. It takes decades to build institutions, months to destroy them, and years to rebuild institutions. My experience at the University of Delhi, it's possible, but it takes a long time. In the interim, the learning process experiences not only steady erosion, but also cumulative damage. If the present process continues, just imagine what it will do to the capabilities of our students who graduate even a decade from now, say in 2035. Yeah? A schooling system which is learning by rote, learning outcomes are dreadful, superimposed with the university system that I'm seeking to describe and evaluate. Now, at this juncture, we would do well to remember that our earlier higher education system, I came through it, many people with gray hair came through it, or even not with gray hair came through it, despite its flaws and warts, is the source of India's soft power, embedded in a diaspora across the contemporary world. The guys who are corporate leaders, thought leaders in the United States are not people who were born in the United States. They are people who were born, brought up, and educated in India, and then migrated. The same flawed education system. Now, in his address to the nation from ramparts of Red Fort in Delhi on 15th August 2022, Prime Minister Modi pledged to transform India into a developed country by the centenary of India's independence in 2047. This is obviously a desirable aspiration, but it is easier said than done. Education is critical at every stage of the income level transition, from low income through lower middle income, where India is now, to upper middle income and high income categories, where higher education is absolutely critical. Education then is of utmost importance in the initial stages because there's a path dependence, while it is just as important in escaping what economists call the middle income trap. But it continues to matter for countries. It continues to matter for countries even as they climb the ladder to the high income level, simply to stay there. Now, the challenge that confronts India in realizing this ambition is what economists call the middle income trap. You know, countries make the transition from low income to middle income status, get stuck there, unable to move from middle income to high income status, which has been the fate of most countries in Latin America and most countries in Asia, but for a few exceptions. Now, the first stage, and forgive me, that's the only economics I'm going to say, the first stage in the transition is driven by cheap labor and high investment rates. Growth slows down as these factors wane in their impact. Industrialization stops at labor-intensive goods as wages rise. The second stage in the transition requires higher productivity levels and a capacity to innovate. Now, in comparison with the East Asian miracle stories, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and now China, India has been a huge laggard in industrialization. Malaysia and Thailand, success stories until the late 90s, at much higher income levels than India, are stuck in that same trap. Now, India has the potential for continuing its rapid economic growth. In my assessment, it will attain upper middle income status around 2035. But the chances that it can get there in 2047 are close to negligible. It must think now in a longer-term perspective, where higher education has to be center stage. Education has to be center stage. You know, you need to nurture managerial capabilities in individuals, technological capabilities in firms. You need to foster vertical diversification, technological upgrading, technological learning, creating R&D capacities. We are terrible laggards in all these spheres. Now, the development of all such capabilities in individuals, firms, and the economy as a whole requires time in terms of decades rather than years. Now, the attainment of these strategic long-term objectives, the development experience of success stories in Asia suggests, depends on the quality of higher education as well as research, and the design as well as implementation of industrial policy, in both of which the government has a critical role. The government, I'll forget about industrial policy, is doing the opposite of what it needs to be done in higher education and research. Now, unless we introduce the much-needed correctives in higher education here and now, Viksit Bharat will remain an elusive quest and an unattainable objective. My focus in this lecture, may I say, has been on India. But attitudes of governments and politics towards universities are changing profoundly in much larger number of countries across the world. If people have an interest, I'd be happy to address questions on that, but it's time for me to stop. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for listening.